Hello and welcome to my Extreme Desert Guide. In this video I'm going to share with you all my knowledge, all my tips and tricks that I know about survival in the Extreme Desert Biome. I'm going to talk about what you're going to need, how to survive with every start, what's important and what you shouldn't do, and how your colonists should look like, and all that stuff will be covered in this tutorial. If you like this kind of content, please subscribe to my channel and get informed when I bring up new tutorials for Rimworld. So first off, I created, for the sake of the example, a complete dirt ball. This is just Extreme Desert everywhere, but it's pretty important because I wanted to talk about how to select your colony to begin with. Most worlds have only a few patches of Extreme Desert, but in this scenario, I'm going to talk about the value of your starting tile. For example, this is pretty much one of the hardest Extreme Desert starts. You would be completely away from civilization, your next trade partner is super far away, and you have to rely on wandering tradesmen and later on orbital traders. You're pretty cut off. If your colony needs anything, you're going to need, let's see, a travel time of three and a half days, one tour, so 7 days back and forth to get some trade gotten down. That's pretty hard, believe me. On the other side, if we would decide to settle down here, we would be in best company. Well, these guys around us are hostile to begin with, but a few presents later, they are our friends for sure. So we have 0.5 days into this direction, 1.26 days there, 0.3, 0.2. So once we would befriend these guys, everything would be super nice. We could be going in the vicinity of these tribal people, and long story short, the more trade connections your starting tile has, the easier it gets. Also, mountainous tiles are very beneficial for your Extreme Desert start. That's due to various reasons, but mainly because wood is almost non-present on these maps, and stone is your go-to material to build pretty much everything. And on a flat tile, your resource availability is pretty low. So these are the things. Also, keep in mind that Extreme Desert doesn't always mean that there's always some super high temperature to grow crops the whole year. There's also the same thing. We have here, well, the growing periods here are pretty low because I have a world with pretty low rainfall, but just keep an eye out on the growing periods and the average temperatures, because that'll bring you much more information. So that's the start for the location. There's not pretty much more to talk about. Just try and find your own biome and positioning of your liking. For this tutorial, we're going to crash down on this small hill area here, and I'm going to get next to the colonist. I went with the rich colonist single starred. The contents of this tutorial will cover you up with pretty much every start. First off, I want to emphasize which stats I think are pretty important. So I'm going to roll a little bit around until I find somebody who's having what I need. I would be strongly recommending that you're straying away of incapabilities if you're starting solo, of course, but generally said, the most important stats for the desert are, in my humble opinion, this is some good guy. Some kind of combat skill is very beneficial, like here we take the melee. Construction is very important because it's always important to have a good constructor in the beginning. Mining and plants are the two key components that I want to emphasize here so much. We're going to get right into that because John is a pretty good starting character here, and let's crash land there to cover up the second half of the tutorial, where we're going to talk about how to start to build your colony in the desert, and the third part will be about the longevity and the long-term survival of your colony. So there goes. I'm looking around here The mini-map is modded, so you don't have that on a vanilla game, but for the sake of the tutorial, I found it a very useful thing. If we look around on this map, the first thing that we should talk about is that there's really nothing. Nothing except for rocks, a few patches of grass here and there. Usually there's at least one lone saguaro on the map, and this is by average, so you can play a little mini game when you live longer in the desert. There will be one cactus growing somewhere if you look closely enough. There. I told you, there's pretty much every time one hanging around somewhere, and this is your sole source of wood on the map, period. So to begin with, you have to hold tight on whatever wood you have, because it's such a valuable commodity here in the desert. It's insane. You won't be having huge stockpiles of wood on your own until you have researched the tree sowing technique, and let's put it up here. This one. Then you would be able to sow down trees on the few patches of arable soil that we have, which would be the next thing I want to talk about. There's really not much going on here in terms of food generation. The wildlife here consists of a handful of iguana, and honestly, don't expect that there will be pretty much more than that happening around here. Most of the time of the year, there's nothing on the map, so you won't be able to rely on hunting too much. It's a lucky case if you get somebody shot down. So, animal migration is the most common source of meat on the desert, and that's why I emphasized a high value of plants so much. Because to begin with, on every run on the Extreme Desert, I would scout out where I want to build and then immediately drop down some growing zone to grow myself some potatoes. Potatoes are, well, let's do this here. The potatoes have a specific reason. They have a very low fertility sensitivity. They have a very high tolerance towards high temperatures, and they have a very high average yield, so they are the perfect averaging crop in this area. If we go for the rice plant, for example, which has a very high fertility sensitivity, which means ideally you would be growing rice somewhere where it's better than 70% to speed up the process to have more output. And the corn plant has a pretty similar thing. It has the highest yield, the highest growing time as well, but well, from my experiences so far, I've really always fared well with the potato, but feel free to choose your own crop. The only thing I want to really emphasize here is start farming pretty much from minute one, because the stuff you're having to begin with will be pretty much everything you have for the first quadrum, so it's really important. About the space where you want to put up your base. Keep in mind that there are these nasty patches of soft sand here. I put up the grid here, which are hampering with your building plans pretty severely. So while this area might be looking really nice on the first glance because of the gorges here and the ability to close up quite easily, these big patches of soft sand with their big walk speed penalty are pretty nasty and possibly better as a line of defense for your colony than as your actual living spot. So what I really like to use in the Extreme Desert are complexes like these. Here we see there's really a lot already going on for me, and to begin with, I really like to do one of two things. Either I decide to sacrifice some of my starting steel to do something like this. So go for that. And finish this corroded building somehow. So if we do something like this, we're going to get a roof over our heads really quickly. And then I drop down the stockpile zone in here. And let's get John into some moving stance, so we have something moving while the tutorial goes on. Just configuring two things, and let's continue. So after this has been settled, the next step would be, like I already mentioned, we're going to delete that because I don't want him to start sowing out potatoes out there. So I would be starting something like this, and really use every little nook and cranny, use everything you have. You don't have too much soil to work with, so it's really good to use whatever you can. So the next big enemy of yours in the desert is the heat. When you're starting on the naked brutality, this problem is huge, of course, because you are very, very vulnerable towards heat. And John here is only insulated towards temperatures of 30 degrees plus, so he's going to suffer from a heat stroke pretty soon as well. So that's why building up a power source is extremely important during the early game. There are a lot of different solutions for the heat problem. First off, of course, the most permanent solution is clothing. Try to get some clothing which insulates you properly against the temperatures, but most of the time you won't be able to begin to do that to begin with. Look at that, we have a nice room over here too. So this is more of a long-term goal with the clothing. The short-term goals can be achieved with dropping down some wind turbine and some cooler in your living area. While you're not having a steady source of power to begin with, this is not too much of a problem though, because it is enough to have the power from time to time, because the heat stroke builds up really steadily. That's a percentage rising and dropping, and if across the days there's enough power to cool down the living room sometimes of the day, fine, wonderful, that's all you needed. And that's why a unsteady source of wind power is absolutely okay to survive with until you have researched the battery technology, which I strongly would recommend if you would use this kind of strategy. Let's drop down the things like this so we can keep the game running. So this is the first solution. If you don't have the luxury of having somebody with that kind of construction, or not enough steel, or not enough components, or whatever might be the case, there's also the option to go for a passive cooler. But, well, the passive cooler costs 50 wood. He cools down a room enough to ensure your survival for the time it runs. But since wood is such a scarce commodity in the desert, use it wisely. It is pretty much something I would use if I was close to dying due to heat. And this would be a good reason to do that, of course. So most of the time, most of the starts don't put you under that huge amount of pressure. You either have, with the tribal start, some wood to begin with, so you can build a few passive coolers until your trees, which you could plant with a tribal start, because you start with a tree sowing technology right away from the scratch. So you could start a cycle of cooling there. You could use the wood to begin with to cool your people at the start, immediately start sowing trees, boom. So there will be a solution to that problem. With the high-tech starts, of course, you see what I'm doing here. This is perfectly enough. This will bring you through the time until you have properly done the research. So next up is pretty much, that's everything you need to begin with. You're going to start your usual base scenario. You want to build up a freezer unit if you can. If you have the electric power. So in this scenario, I would really say we're going to build a steel door over here, and this would be my freezer unit. Make your food long lasting, that's really important, and Well, the beginning time of your colony is the hardest time, and it is absolutely viable and often necessary to travel to your neighbors during the early game and barter for things like food or wood. These two things are so important during the early game. Food and wood are completely okay to invest your first like 2 or 3 thousand silver into. If you have to do that to ensure the survival of a colony, you're doing nothing wrong. You're doing the correct thing to ensure the survival of your colony. Also, if you have animals during the early game, well, I'm really sorry to say that, but this is making everything a lot easier if you actually butcher the animal right away, because you don't have the resources to maintain an animal at the beginning. Animals are eating food. They offer you something, but only as a long-term investment. And the Extreme Desert early game doesn't give you the luxury of allowing you long-term investments. Most of the time, the husky would only eat like a lot of rations that I would and that I could survive a lot more days with. This might be a little bit brutal, but well, that's just extreme biomes sometimes make such things necessary to ensure your survival. Also, hunt everything you can outside there, and stockpiling food is absolutely correct. So, as a matter of fact, I would strongly advise you to do like twice or even triple the amount of farming than you would usually do on your other colonies. That's because every environmental effect like cold snaps, heat waves, toxic fallouts, this stuff strikes you harder than on other biomes, because you're 100% relying on agriculture to begin with. So basically, once you're getting denied your agricultural income, you're having a zero income of food on this map. So having big stockpiles is so important on this biome. I can't emphasize it enough. This could pretty much kill you in the mid-game if your food stockpiles are too low because you took the successful early game too easily. That's something I really can't emphasize enough. Another thing, produce cloth as soon as possible and stockpile medicine as well. If you can, even plant it somewhere where you can. That's why the plant skill is also so important. Mining, construction, and plants are the most important skills to begin with. Crafting and artistic skills are, of course, also very welcome, because you can turn the mineral stuff here into income, because basically I would strongly recommend to buy whatever you need from your neighbors. Rely on trade as heavily as you can if you want to make your early game as hospitable as possible without making it too easy, because caravanneering and trading sure puts you under some risk, especially during the early game. Don't worry, you're going to sweat when you're having only one or two people in your base and you're getting raiders. Don't worry, there's the good fun. So that's that. I don't have much more to say about the Extreme Desert to begin with. It's a pretty rough place. You won't be able to sustain big animal herds or too big colonist amounts. Be always super careful with how many people you pick up in your colony. That's maybe something I forgot to mention. Always think about how much food you have and if you can sustain another person. There's absolutely no shame in banishing somebody. If you notice that you made a mistake here, you can, in the bio, banish somebody. This will make your colonists unhappy for a while, but the debuff is quite moderate compared to the debuff of a death of a colonist. So yeah. So to sum it up, I want to talk lastly a little bit about the research tree, and then we're going to head over to the ending. So research-wise, I would strongly recommend to consider tree sowing, and cocoa is also a very strong technology, although it is a long-growing thing, but I want to emphasize the fertility sensitivity of the tree. And long story short, once you hit this spot, the desert becomes a lot more sustainable. A very, very valuable technology to begin with. Apart from that, let's check it out. Of course, the geothermal power is always very, very desirable. Battery technology, of course, is super interesting. Air conditioning is very, very important as well. If you're not starting with it, complex clothing is also vital to ensure your long-term survival. Apart from that, solar panels are also very useful because you have a lot of sun time, obviously, and you don't have too much blockages. But wind power is really way to go in the desert. You don't have to mess around with stuff, messing around with your area. And depending on your area, the deep drilling technology can help you a lot if you're not having enough mountains around you to sustain you with materials. Apart from that, the other technologies are not too vital for the desert biome as such. So I hope that was of some help for you, and feel free to drop me a comment down below if you have any questions left that I didn't answer in this video. Drop a like on this video or share it with your friends if you want to convince other people that you think that this thing is worth watching. See you guys next time. Bye bye.